Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another series of webinar organized by Singapore Training and Development Association. My name is William Ledbetter from Performativity, and I will be your moderator for this morning's session. Today, we have the privilege of having two experts sharing with us their perspectives on the new paradigm of work and how we should approach learning and management in today's knowledge economy. Current businesses are at a major inflection point in the history of business. The Industrial Revolution and the labor-intensive economy it spawned have been replaced by a mind-intensive knowledge economy that's driven by technology, automation, AI, and globalization. The practices and policies created for the labor-intensive industries can no longer meet the needs of mind-intensive businesses. It's become abundantly clear that an entirely new approach to organizing, operating, managing, and learning in the knowledge economy is needed. A small number of companies already understand this imperative. They've gotten ahead of the curve and have started providing the example companies need to succeed in this new economic environment. The number of companies that are refining management and learning practices has been growing steadily over the past decade or so, and can now be recognized as a worldwide trend. The new business model these companies are developing to meet the needs of our mind-intensive knowledge economy is already proving to be superior in helping employees learn new professional and personal skills, skills that make their companies more agile, innovative, and competitive. And employees working for companies that are managed according to these new principles feel more challenged, engaged, fulfilled, and valued, leading to increased collaboration, productivity, and higher employee retention rates. Let me introduce our two speakers this morning, David Gribo and Stephen J. Gill. David is an author, popular speaker, consultant, workshop leader, and CEO of Knowledge Star. Since 2006, Knowledge Star has provided research and consultative services to companies seeking innovative ways to use emerging technology to help empower and enable their employees anytime from any location. Knowledge Star has worked with numerous Fortune 500 companies, startups, NGOs, and leading analyst firms, including Burson & Associates and the Brandon Hall Group. For 25 years prior to starting Knowledge Star, David held senior development and management positions with leading technology and education companies, including IBM, where he co-founded the Institute for Advanced Learning, PeopleSoft, Cisco, and McGraw-Hill. David is a co-author creating a learning culture with Marcia Connor and James Clausen, and author of A Compass for the Knowledge Economy. He has written numerous research papers and articles on management and educational technology, and has served on the editorial review board for 6 books about management, technology, and learning from Information Age Publishing. Since 2007, he has been writing the award-winning and widely read Knowledge Star blog. He is the co-author on Minds at Work, which shows that the foundation for management models used today is 100 years old, how successful companies have changed to new models, and what they've gained by doing so. A native of Manhattan and a graduate of Harvard University, David lives in San Francisco, California. Stephen is co-owner, or rather Stephen J. Gill, is co-owner of www.learningtobegreat.com, a resource for creating and sustaining a learning culture in organizations, and is also owner and principal of Stephen J. Gill Consulting. He attended the University of Minnesota and Northwestern University, where he earned a PhD degree in counseling psychology. Steve's expertise is in organizational learning and measuring the impact of learning and performance improvement interventions. He has done this work for more than 30 years, since leaving the faculty of the University of Michigan School of Education. He has written extensively about learning in organizations. His most recent books are Getting More from Your Investment in Training, the 5 A's Framework, Developing a Learning Culture in Nonprofit Organizations, and communication in high-performance organizations, principles and best practices. Steve also posts regularly on www.theperformanceimprovementblog.com. Steve is the co-author of Minds at Work and developed assessments for measuring the learning culture of organizations and their readiness to move from the previous way of managing and learning to the methods and practices required for success in this new knowledge economic environment. He lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and served his community for 12 years as an elected trustee of Washtenaw Community College. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
All right, folks, we are making the presentation tonight on managing in the knowledge economy, critical new strategies for success. The introduction basically said everything we're going to say, so we're going to sound as if we're repeating ourselves. Thank you. We are always playing with this slideshow, and as we present these, we always come up with new titles, and so we decided tonight to change the title to this, Change Forever, and you need to know why and how. Just in case you didn't see the two of us in a more relaxed way, this is David and Steve. I'm on your left, Steve's on your right. We both hate those formal pictures that you'll see if you buy the book, so this is how we look when we're out having lunch.
I'm glad you explained who is who.
Well, we wanted to put your Johnny Depp picture up, Steve, but we decided we'd stay with the original one. The beginning starts out with an exclamation. The exclamation for us has a lot of meaning. Past 50 years, and Steve and I are both older than 50 years, and I'll tell you why that means something in a moment, but in the last 50 years, there's been an incredibly dramatic change in the way we work. We've spent thousands and thousands of years, tens of thousands of years in what we look at as a labor-intensive style. And what that means is that we've come through an agricultural era and through two incredibly quick and powerful industrial revolutions, and all of it has been labor-intensive. Labor-intensive for us means we work with our hands, we produce things with our hands, we made things with our hands. In less than 50 years, most people on this call right now, and most of us who work in the industrial world, actually work with our minds. We produce work with our minds. So the wow is an exclamation of how fast things have changed from a labor-intensive to what we call a mind-intensive workforce. The reason that that's important is that that change is so powerful and profound that it's creating structural economic changes for everybody. The change is so basic that the impact on the institutions that we've developed during that labor-intensive period have to change now and refocus and in a way reinvent themselves to become mind-intensive workplaces. It stands to reason, if you think about it, when you're in an economic era and basically what you're doing to figure out how to organize your workforce. During the two industrial revolutions, we organized work so that we managed hands and we focused on production. Scientific management starts with the study of hands and how fast they can work and how much they can produce. So most of the institutions and most of the workplaces that we have were developed during this labor-intensive period. In the last 50 years, now that we've changed to what we call mind-intensive, because most of us produce work with our minds and not our hands, we need to change the institutions as well, which means we need to change our companies, we need to change the way they're structured, we need to change the way we work, the way we manage people, and more than anything, the way people learn. Now, what does this mean for you? This is the most important question, and I think it has different meanings depending upon who's listening. If you're running a company, it means that you have to think about how you've organized your company, and are you in the more labor-intensive world, or have you moved into the future where things are now mind-intensive? Are you still organizing your company in a way that's managing hands, or have you organized your company in a way that's managing minds? If you're an employee, for example, and you're working in a company that's managing hands in the old labor-intensive model, you have to realize that pretty soon you're going to be called upon to be working in a company that's managing minds, because your company will have to change or it won't succeed. That's what we learned in our research. The companies that have been slow to adapt have had problems succeeding in this new managing mind-intensive labor market. So you have to look at where you are working and what it means for you in terms of your professional and your personal development. If you're working in a company and you're in charge of managing people, and you're a manager listening to my voice right now, then you have to ask yourself a question: are you helping those people? If you're working in a way that needs to be mind intensive and you need to be managing minds, are you managing minds? Are you doing the things that we're going to be talking about that help you manage minds? Or are you kind of stuck in an old way of management, which is very disabling when it comes to helping people grow and produce their best work if they're working with their minds? And if, for example, you're a person who's involved with training, it's going to be very clear in a few minutes why you need to change, if you haven't already, from the way you're previously doing your training, which is the old sage on the stage classroom model, whether it's classroom in an actual classroom or a virtual classroom, from that model to the new model, which is anytime and any place and anywhere training, because that's what people need in a mind-intensive environment.
David,
Stephen.
can I break in here for a second? For those of
Surely.
you that are trainers, instructional designers, training managers, chief learning officers, or anything similar to that, we believe this has profound implications for you. If you were, we have been training in terms of developing formal training. That is a response to that managing hands work environment. It is a response to a time when people could be trained in a specific task or a set of tasks, and maybe even for their career, that's what they would do. And we'll go into more detail, but with the change, the acceleration of change that's going on, and the move to the need for more of a managing minds environment, the shift has to be to preparing people to constantly be developing their minds, continuous learning, continuous development of their minds, not in preparation for a task, but in preparation to be lifelong learners. Thank you, David. Just wanted to add that.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So the upshot of all this is that, just to recap for a second, the change has been dramatic. It's happened in a very short amount of time. We've gone from a labor-intensive way of doing work to what we call a mind-intensive doing work. The difference is, in the labor-intensive world, we worked with our hands, we made things with our hands. In the mind-intensive world, where most of us listening to this are, we perform work with our minds. Everything we do because of our minds and our ability to use our minds. The implication is that we need to radically change the way we do things. And the reason that I use the word radical is that when you look at the difference, and as we go through this, we'll take a quick look at the differences in the two different kinds of companies, the different characteristics in companies that are labor-intensive, managing hands, and mind-intensive, managing minds. The difference is dramatic, and the difference means that the change has to be as dramatic as the characteristics will tell you. Now, what we're talking about really is what Steve and I call the great inflection point. If you look at the bottom of the chart there, where it shows agricultural and industrial, that's the labor-intensive period that we've come through. And that hockey puck, that great inflection, happens very quickly. And I would say where that dot is at the center of the diagram, that's pretty much where we are today. We're at the very beginning of this inflection. And that's important to remember, because at the beginning of all these major changes in economies, from agricultural to industrial to knowledge, it's never clear to anybody what we have to do to move forward. Everybody's kind of playing catch up, and everybody's trying to figure out what to do next. Everybody feels that things are changing so quickly and dramatically that it's very hard to understand what needs to be done. What we found out in our research is that there are some companies at that point, at that great inflection point, that are starting to figure it out. And a lot of our research was based on looking at what those companies are doing and understanding from them how we all need to move forward. Now, the reason these changes are not going to stop is we've discovered, and we've talked about 5 basic, what we call unstoppable horses. There are a lot of people who wish this would just go away and it would reverse itself or slow down. But our sense from everything we read every day is that it's not only slowing down, it's speeding up. And the 5 forces right there are in front of us, and all of us have been impacted by them, and all of us experience them every single day. The point of this slide is that the forces that are making this inflection happen are not stopping, and so that means we have no choice. We have to adapt, and if we're running companies, that means we have to adapt the entire company. If we are working in companies that are not adapting, we have to think about if we want to stay there, because our personal and professional growth is important to us. And if we are developing programs in those companies, for example, training programs, we have to think about how we're developing them, and are we looking backward or are we looking forward? Are we developing them in the way we used to develop them for the last 100 years? Or are we thinking about what people need if they're in a managing mind organization going forward into the future? One of the cartoons that we saw recently that caught our attention that we thought was spot on about the paradigm shift. This is such a change in the last 50 years that the paradigm shift means if you are not aware of it and you haven't paid attention to it, you need to start looking around to see what you're going to do next. Now, just to give you an example of the change, I'm in San Francisco, and I sometimes go to Silicon Valley, to Palo Alto, and there's a pizza company called Zoom Pizza. Now, I'll order my pizza and I'll sit there and wait, and I know from having spoken to the owners that Pepe and Giorgio are out back and they're squirting on the sauce, and you have Maria and you have Bruno, and they're spreading it in circles just the way you're supposed to do, just like they do in Italy. And then they pass it over to Vincenzo, and he puts the pizza in the oven. Action. The thing that's fascinating is that they don't stop for a minute, because Pepe, Giorgio, Marta, and Bruno, and Vincenzo are what they call cobots, or robots. These are the robots working in the kitchen, and the pizza is made by the robots. Now, human employees still put on the toppings, and they still may provide things that the customer needs in terms of drinks or something like that, but all the pizzas are made in the kitchen by the robots. And the owners are proud to say that what they end up with is what they call an artisanal robotic pizza. And it made us ask a question. Even if something as simple as pizzas are being made in this new managing mind environment by automation, because somebody is writing the programs for these pizza making robots, if there are no hands left to manage, what's left, and what we've come up with, is you need to start managing minds. Steve, you want to talk a little bit about one of the companies on our list that we did some research on?
Yeah, I would like to do that. But before I do that, I want to give an example of what's happening in Singapore for those of you that are in Singapore listening to this presentation. I understand that autonomous and connected vehicles or self-driving cars are big in Singapore right now. The development of those vehicles and putting them on the street is happening as we speak in Singapore, and that your country wants to be a leader in that technology in the future. Well, think about the implications. What are the implications for learning, for training, for developing employees? What's going to be the impact? Now, hopefully, as promised, it will reduce accidents and it will improve transportation. I know the transportation in Singapore is a very important issue, but what will people have to know about operating a self-driving car? What will they have to know about transportation? What will they have to know about the trucking industry? And how will this affect their businesses? And this is going to be a rapidly accelerating industry or impact on industry. And how can we help people keep up with that? If we're just managing tasks, we won't be able to do it. We have to prepare people for that rapid change that's occurring so that they can be continually learning and getting up to speed in just that one technology. So wanted to add that. Now let me talk about one example, and that's the Menlo Innovations, which is that little circle up in the right with the M in the middle. This is a relatively small company. It happens to be in my hometown in Ann Arbor, Michigan. It is a software development company, but the co-founder of the company has written a book about creating joy in the workplace. So he's committed to developing employees and giving people the opportunity to grow and develop and to learn in the workplace as a primary purpose of the business. They develop software in teams. They're constantly changing teams. They're constantly sharing information with each other. They're constantly learning. And you have to fit in well with that culture. But if you do, it's a wonderful development experience. So that's one company that is focused on managing minds in the software industry, which is notoriously not very pleasant place to work, at least as I know it in the States. But I think that's true around the world. But they've been able to create an environment that is joyful and a wonderful place to work. So that's one example. David?
Do you want to mention the $20,000 visit, Steve?
Oh, right. You love that. So many people have been interested in how they do their work in their workplace at Menlo Innovations that they now bring people in to do workshops on how Menlo does work. And for a company to come in, they're charging $20,000 for a 3-day workshop. So there you go. That's the interest that they've created in the workplace.
Thanks, Stephen. And again, this is just a few of the companies that we looked at. And these are the companies that have already figured out how to make that change from a labor-intensive world to a mind-intensive world. I'm going to talk a little bit about UKTV. UKTV is a television station, and they're in Cardiff, Wales. And they're run by a new CEO called Darren Childs. Now, if you think about it, the whole focus of a TV station is producing work with your mind. It's a creative endeavor. You try to do the best you can in terms of performance, and your performance is all about your meetings, your interviews, time on the phone, talking to other people, writing scripts, producing TV programs, and that's what they do. They were not doing very well 5 years ago, and Darren Childs said, what's the problem? What is going on here? We don't seem to have the engagement that we need. We're having difficulties with retention and with hiring. We're not outstanding in our market, and we need to change. What he realized was that the company was structured according to the old labor-intensive model, the one that he had inherited from the past 100+ years of labor-intensive work. Because during that labor-intensive period, we created all the models that most of us are used to, and that was what the TV station had inherited, and that's what he had inherited. So the station was divided into two separate floors. People worked in cubes, people had offices. It's all the things we're used to in the way workspaces and workplaces are done. He decided that the first thing he wanted to do was completely change the physical environment. So they took out the separation of the floors, they opened up the office, and they did some things that a lot of people initially didn't like, because when you change over from a labor-intensive to a mind-intensive workplace, the changes sometimes are so radical and so different that it's very hard to get used to, but eventually they start to work. So for example, he took away all the offices that the managers had. Managers stopped working off on their own. They stopped separating themselves from everybody else, and they found themselves working in collaboration with people. They took away the desks from people. People didn't have their own desks. They started to think of themselves as nomads. They would move from desk to desk, and they would reconfigure the workspaces according to the projects they were producing or the TV programs they were working on. If they needed private space, they'd find that. It may be the space that's private over in a corner of the office one day, and next week it might be another corner. It didn't make any difference as long as they were getting their work done. They weren't bound to a specific desk. And if you think about the labor-intensive model, especially if you look at, say, a factory, people had exactly the same spot, and they went to it every day, and they were there at the same time, and they punched in and they punched out, and that was their life. And that was the model. A couple of years before Darren Childs changed what happened at UKTV, that reflected the model that people had when they started working in cubes. So cubes disappeared, offices disappeared, technology became incredibly flexible. One of the things I've noticed is that when you go into a company and it's still mired in the old labor-intensive world, it's very difficult to find a plug. I oftentimes want to plug in my PC, or I need to recharge my phone, and I have to look all over the place for a plug. The old offices that were built during the labor-intensive universe weren't built for the technology that we use these days. So the first thing he did is he reorganized the space so there's plenty of places to go plug in whatever you need to, and all the information they have now is put up into the cloud. What that means is that you can work anywhere, you can work anytime, and everybody has access to the information so that everybody can share and collaborate and communicate. He then went further, and he started to do what some people refer to as radical transparency. In order to have the company really work as a company, in order for people to really communicate and collaborate, which is one of the hallmarks of these new managing mind companies, they started holding weekly town meetings. Now, in these weekly town hall meetings, what they would do is that they would share the successes, and they would also share the failures. The executives would talk about things that normally the executives only once upon a time in a labor-intensive world would only talk to each other about. Now everybody was open, and everybody was sharing everything, and everybody knows everything. That's another big change in these companies as they move into this mind-intensive space. If you think about it, it's more like a hive. If everybody knows what's going on, then as things start to happen, everybody can react. Aside from the weekly town hall meetings, they had a black box, and it was called the unasked questions box. In other words, if a week went by and you had a question and for some reason you were afraid to ask, you weren't sure what the response would be, it might be a question that might be something directly opposite what somebody else who you think is in charge of the company wants you to do. You can put the question in the black box, and at the end of the week, everybody gets a chance to look at these questions, and they're all discussed and shared. The other big thing they did is they started to recruit for values. They were very careful about stating their values. The values of the organization are very simple. They have 5: create, learn, influence, challenge, and collaborate. That's it. No big value statement, no complex value statement. Very simple, 5 simple words: create, learn, influence, challenge, and collaborate. And they started to recruit for those values. And that reflects another thing that some of these managing mind companies are doing. Spotify, for example, is another company. It's not on this list, but they have this approach where they hire for culture and they train for skill. They understand that once you bring somebody into the company, if it's a bad fit, it doesn't matter how you train them. They're not going to be happy, they're not going to be engaged, and they're not going to be performing at their best. And if your company is depending upon how people's minds are working and how people's minds are producing, if they're not performing at their best, if they're not happy, if they're not engaged, you're not going to get their best work. So the upshot of all this and a few other changes that they made that we cover in the book is that this company, UKTV, which is a small company again in Cardiff, Wales, went from a 4% share to a 10% market share. And what market share means in the TV world is that they now have 10% of all the viewers in the UK. They doubled their value in less than 5 years. And their workers, as they are assessed and as they are surveyed, say that they're much more engaged, they're much happier, and it's a much more creative workforce. And one of the things that Darren Child says that I thought was important is that he mentioned that you can't create a perfect culture. It's just a never-ending process. And that's one of the other things we found about all of the companies on this list and all of the companies that are in the book. It's a process. Moving from this labor-intensive world to this mind-intensive world, everybody is now learning how to do it. And again, it's that first wow slide. All of this has happened within 50 years. Steve, do you want to add anything to that?
Only to say that there are big differences among these companies, but as you made the point, David, what they have in common is their continual effort at trying to create a culture in which people are supported in their learning and where everybody is focused on development of every employee. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Steve. We're going to go over really quickly some of the characteristics that we found that differentiates the managing hands companies, the companies that came out of this labor-intensive world, and the managing minds companies, the newer companies that have started to pop up in the last 50 years. To begin with, the first thing we noticed is that the old companies, the managing hand companies, are based on command and control. The new companies have switched over to what we call collaborate and communicate. All of us have experienced command and control. Not all of us have experienced entire companies that are focusing on collaborating and communicating.
David?
Another key character, go ahead, Steve.
David? Yeah, excuse me. As we go through this, I would encourage everybody to be thinking about, where is my organization? Where do we stand? How are we closer to the command and control side, the left side, the managing hand side of this, or closer to the managing minds? And as you have questions about these terms that we're using, this description, please write them down, save them, because at the end of this presentation, you'll have a chance to ask some of those questions. Thank you.
So again, left side, managing hands, labor intensive, right side, managing minds, mind intensive. The second is knowledge is power in the old organization, the labor intensive managing hands organization. In the new organizations, sharing knowledge is power. In the old organizations, it's office spaces, cubes, closed doors, managers' spaces, managers' offices. In the new organizations is what we call learning spaces, to the extent that some companies like Steelcase, for example, are actually trying to create spaces where people can interact, where they can collaborate, where they can communicate. The old organization, things are siloed, they're secretive. In the new organization, it's open and transparent. I mentioned UKTV with radical transparency. Everybody knows everything. Some of the other companies that we looked at, Zingerman's, for example, even though we didn't review it, Zingerman's has open book management. Open book management means that everybody in the company has been trained to understand the basic P&L of the company, and every single day, everybody can find out exactly how the company's doing. The advantage there, if you stop to think about it, is that if the company is in trouble, it's not just going to be a problem that the senior managers have. It's a problem that everybody has. And if it's a problem that everybody has, the potential solution can come from anybody. That's why these managing minds companies are so successful. And finally, one of the things that we noticed also is that often training is pushed in the old model, and in the new model, learning is pulled. What we mean by training is pushed is that it's set up as an event. It was originally done when we adopted the school place model and we put it into the workplace. We had classrooms. We even developed corporate universities. Training was scheduled as an event. Attendance was taken. People raised their hands. You learned what you learned in isolation. You tried to remember it. You were tested and off you went. I call that training just in case because it's the kind of training that you might need just in case someday you have to use it. In the new Managing Mind organization, learning is pulled. And what that means is that learning is always available. It's available in many different ways, and it's available anytime and anywhere. And if you're in the role of developing training, the question to ask yourself is, are you setting it up so that people can pull learning when they need it, where they need it, or are you still training in the old model, which is scheduled and set up as an event? The other thing that's important to me, and as I look at this slide, is that as I walk down the right side, if I think about I'm going to collaborate and communicate with everybody in the company, then everybody has to understand and accept that sharing knowledge is power. We all have to be working in a learning space because we can't be separated from one another because we're all trying to always collaborate and communicate. Information has to be open and transparent, and learning basically is pulled. It's not only pulled when I need it and where I need it, but it may be pulled from some other person who already knows the answer. So there's a lot of collaborating and communicating around the answer. And if I'm someone who's setting up the training, I want to set it up so all these things become part of the picture.
David?
Go ahead, Steve.
So another implication of the pull versus pushed approach to learning is that employees need to know how to learn. If they're going to get the learning when and where they need it on demand throughout the day, not dependent on a professional trainer, then they need to learn how to learn. So the job of training or learning professionals in the future will be heavily on helping people learn how to learn, helping teams learn how to learn, and helping whole organizations learn how to learn. Thanks, David.
Steve, another piece of that too is that I think managers in the future are going to have to be able to learn to enable and empower people to learn, as opposed to just sending somebody off to a course. The idea is going to be to provide them with the technology and an understanding of how to use that technology, find out what they need when they need to learn it, and start to share it amongst themselves. So manage play also. As we get towards the end, hopefully you'll have lots of questions, and we apologize for that little rough beginning. One of the questions we have is sometimes technology doubles back on us and it's hard to use, but hopefully at this point you've gotten the gist of what we're trying to say, and that is we've moved very quickly into this new mind-intensive space. And because the unstoppable factors that are not going to change, that are forcing this new world on us, we really don't have any choice anymore. We have to think about the best way to possibly move forward and to succeed in this mind-intensive environment. Because Steve and I come from a training background where we've learned that review is important. Just to recap really quickly, we've gone through this incredibly rapid change. Not all companies have been able to adapt. They haven't been quick enough to adapt. There's a list of companies that are in the corporate boneyard. There's a kind of corporate Darwinism in effect here, where if you can't change and adapt quickly enough, you will basically be overtaken by a company that almost comes out of nowhere these days, that understands what it means to be a mind-intensive organization and manage minds. The other key points are the old structures are disabling, because if you're in a labor-intensive environment, it restricts you from collaborating and communicating. It puts you into command and control structures, which means that you really have a hard time learning what you need to learn when you need to learn it. It's not an optimal environment, in other words, for a company where work being produced by your mind has to happen as quickly and as effectively as possible. The new structures that some of the companies we mentioned have reinvented themselves with are structures that support and enable people's minds at work, and they enable people to do their best work. The forces are not going to go away. The change and the pressure to change is only going to increase. And that short list that we showed you, which is about less than 50% of the companies we looked at, those companies really now are models for us. They're companies we can learn from. In the past 50 years, many of those companies are new, and some of those companies have been around longer than others, but almost all of them are 50 years or young. Those are the companies that are basically reinventing themselves and have evolved into a managing mind role. And if we look at them, they become the role models we need to learn from and follow. And finally, the last point that I want to recap and review, and I want you to remember more than anything, is that there really is no choice. This is the world we're in right now, and even though it's been less than 50 years, we're only at the beginning. In order to be successful, not only as individuals, but as companies, we need to make the change. Steve, do you want to add anything?
I would just add that I think this is the most exciting time for people, for learning professionals, for people who are in the training, instructional design, chief learning officers, all the people that contribute to employees acquiring new knowledge and skills in the workplace. I think there's never been a more exciting time globally for the kind of work that many of you do. So I hope you won't see this as, I hope you won't feel frustrated and scared, but rather you'll take this as a challenge and be excited by the opportunity. Thanks, David.
Now I'd like to open it up for questions. Hopefully we have made you wonder about where you are and where you're going and how to get there. And if there's anything we can do to help in terms of answers, we're looking forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, David and Steve, for that really insightful and well scaffolded argument for the direction of the mind-intensive versus the hand-intensive economies. Lots of questions came to my mind as I was listening to you. Questions involving my excitement with this, and questions involving my concerns as well. And this is something that we talked about before the webinar began, gentlemen. You mentioned about the mind-intensive economy, and you did a fantastic job of presenting very clearly, in a way I don't think anybody could argue with, that we are in fact in the throes and in that point, that turning point from the hand-intensive economies of the agricultural and industrial ages to a now mind-intensive sort of neo-technology age. And you know, I've heard bits and pieces about different companies that have adopted different kinds of new practices to recognize the fact of this. Why would you say, though, that more companies at this time yet have not yet moved into that direction of embracing the idea of a mind-intensive economy and taking the practices in?
Steve, you mind if I answer this one?
Take it away, David.
I think there are two important reasons. One is very surprising to me, and the other is something we all understand. The point that we all understand is that change is really difficult, not only in our personal lives, but when you start to think about organizational change and change management for a company of more than 2 people, it becomes very difficult. When we looked at some of the companies that have made this change, it always started at the top, pushed up from the bottom. There was always a strong leader who was leading the charge and making decisions, and at the same time bringing everybody into those decisions, so it became a collective, if you will. It became a group decision, but still change was difficult. And one of the things we heard is that it's an ongoing process. The second reason, I think, and this directly relates to Steve and I are both over 70. What I've found is that people who have been brought up, not only who have gone to business school and gotten their MBA and learned how to manage, learned how to run a company, but people who have been in these companies for a long time, one of the things that they've done is they've gotten into the habit of imagining still that they are in this labor-intensive universe. It's very, very difficult for them, even if they're in companies where the work is very obviously done using people's minds. It's very, very difficult for them to switch over and change the organization, the structure, the way people are managed, the way people learn, because they don't quite think that it works the best way. And it's also very difficult for them to give up power. It's very difficult for them to give up control. It's very difficult for them to start understanding that sharing knowledge is the key rather than having knowledge is important. And many of the characteristics that we found in the Managing Mind company just feel somehow wrong in these companies who are older. And that's the biggest problem. Big companies like AT&T, where they've decided they have 5 years from about 2 years ago to change over. They've created a new program called AT&T 2020, and it's a learning program. And the focus of the program is to help the people in the company understand something very important. AT&T is no longer going to succeed in the old model as a labor-intensive company managing hands. That's where they started out, that's where their greatness was, and that's how they became an incredibly big company. 7, 8, 9, 10 years, AT&T has suddenly found itself competing with companies that came out of nowhere for the most part, and that are focusing on cell towers instead of the kind of infrastructure that AT&T spent years putting into different countries where they were working. AT&T was built on pulling wires, on putting up poles, on people working at very complex jobs involving lots of hands. They were manufacturing phones. They owned the business. That's how they became big. What they realized a couple of years ago is that if they didn't change and change quickly, as their CEO said recently, they will be going out of business. Hard to imagine a company as big as AT&T going out of business, but it's possible. So Vision 2020 is a chance for them, and again, this is driven at the top from someone who does understand that the old way isn't working anymore. It's a chance for them to retrain the people who are in the company to understand how to do things like design webs, to program, to code all the things that you need to do moving forward as a new telephony company, as a company involved with television. And what they're trying to do is move the company into the future as a company. In some cases, that means some people who are going to be there for another 5 or 6 years have just decided, I'll just finish out my time and retire. And that's fine, because they wouldn't be a strong fit for the new culture. But for everybody else, what the company is trying to do is move them into the future. So change for them is happening even though the managers and the person who runs the company came from this old labor-intensive universe. The understanding is they have to move as a company and they have to move into the future. So it's the two things. One, change is hard, and two, change is even harder for the older line managers who are used to living and working in this labor-intensive model. Hopefully that gets to the question.
Yes, indeed, it did. And I would add to that as well that cultural bias within a company as well. You were talking about culture and changing culture, and it's not just though the age of employees that I've found to be a case, but when a young employee comes into a culture, a new culture, oftentimes they're going to be more chauvinistic towards embracing that culture, and so even a 25 or 30-year-old may well hold on to this old model of working much longer than you expect for a younger person. And I wanted to offer a couple of thoughts that I had in reaction. We were talking about how this paradigm needs to change from separating out roles and embracing roles and left roles. For example, talking about environment for work. And I was just curious, because it struck me that one of the pushbacks people might have towards that is how far do you take that openness and that transparency to the point where then the company becomes not as capable of moving quickly in decision-making processes when so many people are aware of so many areas of the company and are, you know, potentially positing their suggestions? Does that create a situation where you create an inability to move forward? And I was just wondering if that's something that you have you've seen, or is that something that you've considered and have a thought about that?
This is David. We've thought about it and we've seen it, and the exact opposite happens. So it's somewhat counterintuitive. When you have lots of people thinking about what's going on in the company, let's say the company, it's Tuesday morning and something terrible has happened and the company has to deal with it. There's a challenge. Normally what would happen in the old labor-intensive managing hand model is that there'd be a very few people at the top. They'd understand what the problem is. They'd all get together in conference rooms. They'd talk. They talk to each other on the phone. And those few people would make decisions about how the entire company is supposed to meet that challenge. The problem is that other people along the line in the company, further on down in the company, either don't quite understand what the problem is, don't understand the severity of it, don't understand what the company is doing, may not be able to understand it well enough to support it. And oftentimes what we see is that when problems are solved in that way, as effectively, because things happen in the company and people aren't on board, and it seems as if things are a little bit chaotic and there's no clear message and things get muddled. If you take a look at the new Managing Mind company, because of the technology, the ability to communicate and collaborate, you can have lots of people suddenly 2 cents into the problem to the solution, and it makes decisions even faster, and it makes decision making even more agile. The reason for that is, there's a diagram in the book that I like, and it shows a pyramid structure and a circle. The pyramid structure represents the old command and control hierarchy, where decisions are made at the top and the people at the bottom of the pyramid just get told this is what we're doing as a company. In the other part of the diagram, the circle, everybody gets to experience the problem and everybody gets to understand what the solution is, and everybody gets on board with the solution, and everybody can communicate very rapidly. It's very easy for a company these days, if they have an open book management policy, if they've decided that everybody's inclusive, ongoing with everybody in the company, sending out emails to everybody, getting emails back. Of course, you may need a point of focus, you may need somebody to curate the information, but everybody can contribute. And because everybody's contributing, oftentimes what you find is that somebody who you never might have had in that conference room in the old model suddenly comes up with a really good solution. New model, things, even though they are open to everybody, seem to work more effectively, more quickly, and seem to be done in a way that everybody can understand and everybody can support.
David, let me just add to that question that there are cultural differences, and there are national cultural differences, and there are within company cultural differences. And I think it depends on the work of the company, to what extent people are sharing information openly and constantly. So there are some variations. I mean, in some government organizations and some military organizations, and the openness and the involvement might be a little different than you would find in a retail business. Zappos is an online company that sells shoes and apparel online, and they're experimenting with what kind of culture will work best for them. They started eliminating all of their managers and that level, and so theoretically they were going to have no managers, but they're working on what works best. They're experimenting and trying things out and seeing what kind of structure and relationships work best for their organization. But what makes them a Managing Minds company is that they're willing to experiment, they're willing to fail, they're willing to try out new things and see what works best for them. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for that response. I appreciated you commenting on the idea of having a curator, because one of my thoughts was you know, it's great to have everybody suggesting ideas, but then who's the one who plots those ideas, or who says, okay, that you know, let's take these ideas and run with them. That was really I appreciate that. I had two other questions to offer you, but I think we only have time for one of them. So let me try to offer the one that I think might be most relevant to our audience. Trying to imagine myself as an Asian. I've lived here for 15 years and worked here for 15 years, so I'm a little bit aware as a cultural phenomenon what it's like to do business in Asia. And this may be true in other parts of the world as well. But one of the concerns that a person would have as a business person in Asia is having their IP or having their best practices that they've worked very hard to develop passed on easily to somebody in, say, mainland China or one of the developing countries in the area, and losing all that potential revenue because you don't have access, you don't have ownership of your own IP anymore. And when you're talking about sharing knowledge and creating an environment of sharing knowledge and open books, and every member of the team knowing all the intricacies of what formerly the management team would have talked about privately, I ask myself, if I'm an owner of an Asian owner of a business here, would that resonate, or would that make me feel anxious that, you know, perhaps my competitors would just walk in the front door one day, you know, be hired in and basically suck out all my great ideas and all my IP because of this environment? I was just wondering what your response might be to that.
Well, I think nothing really changes in terms of NDAs, for example. People are still, when they work within the context of a company, they're still responsible for maintaining the intellectual property and whatever critical secrets in terms of processes or products, services, or whatever the company has. And they're more invested in it, quite frankly, because they're more invested in the success of the company, and they personally wouldn't want to go share that outside with somebody else, because it would mean the company would falter and they would ultimately lose. So maintaining control over important information still happens within the walls of the company, if you will, the imaginary walls of the company. What's different is that within that company itself, Zingerman's, for example, I mentioned they have an open book management policy where everybody understands the P&L and the financials, and they share the financials all the time. You can log into a private website to find out how the company's doing any day of the week. That doesn't mean that you're going to pick up the phone and talk to a reporter and say, oops, Zingerman slipped this last quarter, sell the stock. It means that you personally will know that the company's doing well, or the company needs to move a little bit more strongly in one area or another, or they've got a challenge that you need to pull everybody together and you need to come up with a solution for. And so the openness and the sharing is within the context of the company, and it's within the context of the mission of the company. It doesn't mean that suddenly all companies in every industry are sharing everything with one another, and whatever happens in one company is given away to another company.
I would just add very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, and that is, we have found, although this may not be universal, but that when employees feel good about their workplace, they feel like they're learning, they feel like they're developing, they don't share secrets. They think about what's best for the company. They don't share IP. You know, they think about, they make decisions based on what's best for the company. When they're afraid, when they're scared, when they don't like coming to work, that's when they share the secrets of the company, and that's when you need to be careful. Great question, though.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. This has been really enlightening, and we're so grateful that you could take the time. I know it's very late for you guys there in California and in Michigan, but we're really grateful for you taking the time to join with us. Once again, this is David and Steve sharing with us about the mind-intensive economy, sharing your insights with our community. For those of you who'd like to watch the recorded version of this webinar, please make sure you subscribe to Stada's channel or visit the website for more information. So on behalf of our speakers and on Stada, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.